You watch her eyes glaze over mid-sentence while you're explaining something you're genuinely excited about, and you can feel the exact moment she checks out of the conversation. You're 3 dates in with someone who seemed interested at first, and now her texts are getting shorter. The gaps between responses stretching longer until one day she just stops replying altogether. You've been single for 2 years, maybe 5, maybe longer than you want to admit, and everyone keeps telling you the same useless advice about confidence and putting yourself out there. But nobody seems to understand that you've tried that, and it doesn't change the fundamental problem. The truth nobody wants to say out loud is that dating as a neurodivergent man puts you at a massive disadvantage in a game where the rules were written for people whose brains work completely differently than yours, and the strategies that work for neurotypical men not only fail for you, but often make things actively worse. You're playing a social game that requires reading subtext you don't naturally perceive, responding to cues you don't instinctively catch, and maintaining a performance of effortless charisma that exhausts you to your core, all while everyone around you insists it should be easy and natural if you just tried harder or cared more. Here's what's actually happening when you struggle with dating, and it has nothing to do with your worth as a person or your capacity to be a good partner. Your brain processes social information differently, which means you're operating on a delay in conversations that move fast. When someone makes a subtle joke or a flirtatious comment, you're still processing their literal words, while the moment for a witty response has already passed. By the time you've figured out what they actually meant, the conversation has moved 3 topics ahead, and your delayed response comes across as awkward or out of place. This isn't about intelligence. You can be brilliant, successful in your career, capable of learning complex systems and solving problems that stump other people. But social interaction in dating contexts requires real-time processing of ambiguous information, and that's precisely where neurodivergent brains struggle most. The woman sitting across from you at dinner doesn't know you're running multiple background processes trying to interpret her body language. Manage your own anxiety. Remember to make appropriate eye contact without staring. Monitor your volume and tone. Think of interesting things to say, and actually listen to what she's saying all at the same time. She just knows the conversation feels off somehow, that something about the interaction doesn't flow the way it does with other guys she's dated, and she can't quite put her finger on why, but it makes her lose interest. The dating scripts that neurotypical people follow instinctively are invisible to you until someone explicitly explains them. And even then, trying to manually execute them makes you come across as robotic or rehearsed. You're supposed to know when to text after getting her number, how long to wait before asking her out, when to initiate physical contact, how to escalate intimacy at the right pace, when to be direct versus when to be playful and ambiguous. Other guys seem to just feel their way through these decisions, but you need clear rules and guidelines. And the problem is that the rules constantly contradict each other depending on context you struggle to read. One woman wants you to be assertive and take charge. Another finds that pushy and wants you to be more tentative and ask permission for everything. And you're supposed to somehow intuit which type she is based on subtle signals you don't naturally pick up on. So you end up either too passive, waiting for clear green lights that never come, or too direct, missing signs that she's not actually interested in making her uncomfortable. The rejection sensitivity that comes with years of social failures makes every interaction feel high stakes, which creates anxiety that interferes with your ability to be present and authentic, which makes the interaction go poorly, which reinforces the rejection sensitivity in a vicious cycle that gets worse over time. You're also dealing with the executive function issues that make consistent effort in dating incredibly difficult to maintain. Dating requires you to remember to text regularly, follow up on conversations, make plans, remember those plans, show up on time, and maintain momentum in getting to know someone, all while managing the rest of your life. But your working memory struggles mean you genuinely forget to respond to messages for days, even when you're interested in the person. You have every intention of texting her back later when you're not busy, but later never comes because the notification disappears, and you completely forget the conversation existed until 3 days have passed, and it's too awkward to respond. You make plans for Friday night, and then accidentally schedule something else on Friday afternoon because you didn't check your calendar or the information just didn't stick in your brain. Time blindness means you're frequently late, even when you care about being punctual. And being late to dates communicates disinterest and disrespect, even though that's the opposite of what you feel. The effort required to manually track all these social obligations and remember to maintain contact with someone you're dating is exhausting in a way that neurotypical people don't experience, and women interpret your executive function struggles as lack of interest or investment in them. The sensory and social exhaustion of dating is something nobody prepares you for. A single dinner date can drain your battery completely because you're managing sensory input from the restaurant environment, maintaining focus on conversation despite distractions, regulating your emotional responses, and consciously controlling behaviors that come naturally to others. The background music is too loud and making it hard to process what she's saying. The lighting is weird and making eye contact more uncomfortable than usual. There are too many people and too much ambient noise, and your brain is spending resources just filtering all of that out so you can function. By the time you get home, you need 2 days of solitude to recover. But she's expecting you to text her that same night saying you had a great time and suggesting when to meet up again. Your need for recovery time after social interaction gets interpreted as disinterest or playing games. And when you try to explain that you need space to recharge, it sounds like a rejection, even though you genuinely want to see her again. You're balancing your limited social energy budget against the requirement to maintain regular contact and frequent dates during the getting-to-know-you phase. And most of the time, you simply don't have enough energy to meet the expectations. If this is hitting close to home, do me a favor and hit that like button. Because what I'm about to tell you next about why your authentic self keeps sabotaging your dating life is something most people are too afraid to say directly. Subscribe if you want the truth about neurodivergent psychology that nobody else is willing to discuss openly. The special interests that give your life meaning and structure are actively working against you in dating contexts. You know how you can talk for hours about the thing you're passionate about, whether that's a particular hobby, a technical subject, a niche area of knowledge, or a creative pursuit. That enthusiasm and depth of knowledge is actually one of your most attractive qualities when directed appropriately. But your brain's tendency to info-dump and monologue about your interests comes across as self-centered and boring when you're supposed to be getting to know someone else. You don't realize you've been talking about your interest for 20 minutes straight, while her eyes glaze over, and she stops asking questions. You think you're sharing something important about yourself and demonstrating your passion and intelligence. But she thinks you're not interested in her because you haven't asked about her life or interests. The reciprocal conversation dance that dating requires doesn't come naturally when your brain wants to explore topics in depth rather than breadth. Other guys are instinctively balancing talking about themselves with asking questions about her, reading her interest level and adjusting accordingly. But you're deep in explanation mode and genuinely don't notice she's checked out until the damage is already done. Your literal thinking and direct communication style violates unspoken dating rules constantly. When she asks what you're thinking, she wants emotional connection and reassurance, but you answer literally about whatever random thought was actually in your head at that moment. When she suggests maybe getting together sometime, you take that as a vague possibility, rather than understanding it's an invitation for you to suggest a specific time and place. When she says she's fine, you believe her rather than recognizing that's code for being upset and wanting you to pursue the real issue. The constant subtext and indirect communication that characterizes early dating is exhausting to decode, and your instinct toward direct, literal communication comes across as socially incompetent or emotionally unavailable. You're not playing hard to get or being aloof strategically. You're just responding to the actual words people say, rather than the hidden meanings you're supposed to infer. This makes you seem either clueless or uninterested, when really you're just operating in a different communication framework. The mask you wear to appear normal in social situations is another major barrier in dating. You've learned over the years to suppress stimming behaviors, to force eye contact even when it's uncomfortable, to laugh at appropriate times even when you don't find something funny, to mirror body language and speech patterns to seem more relatable. This masking takes enormous cognitive effort and emotional energy, and it's not sustainable long-term. So you face an impossible choice in dating. Do you mask heavily during dates to make a good first impression, knowing you can't maintain that performance forever and will eventually disappoint her when the real you emerges? Or do you show up authentically from the beginning and risk immediate rejection before she gets to know your other qualities? Most neurodivergent men end up somewhere in the middle, partially masking while trying to be somewhat authentic, which results in coming across as inconsistent or having a personality that doesn't quite cohere. She meets version 1 of you who's trying hard to appear normal, then version 2 who's exhausted from masking and more withdrawn, then version 3 who feels comfortable enough to info dump about special interests, and she experiences these as different people, rather than understanding they're all you under different levels of cognitive load. The dating market itself is structured in ways that disadvantage neurodivergent men specifically. Online dating, which is how most people meet now, requires you to sell yourself through carefully curated photos and witty written bios that showcase your personality through text. But your strengths don't translate to dating profiles. You're not naturally photogenic because you don't instinctively know how to pose or what facial expressions to make. Your bio either undersells you because you struggle to talk about yourself, or it reads as awkward because you're being too literal and detailed about your interests and qualifications. The texting phase before meeting requires quick, engaging back-and-forth communication that builds attraction through playful banter. But your texting style is either too formal and detailed or too brief and literal. By the time you get to an actual date, many women have already filtered you out based on these preliminary interactions that don't reflect your actual personality or capacity for connection. The men who succeed in online dating are often those who are naturally skilled at self-promotion and witty texting, which correlates with neurotypical social skills, rather than with actual compatibility or relationship potential. The truth about attraction that nobody wants to acknowledge is that first impressions matter enormously, and neurodivergent men typically make poor first impressions through no fault of their own. Research shows people make judgments about trustworthiness, competence, and likability within seconds of meeting someone, based primarily on nonverbal communication like facial expressions, tone of voice, body language, and conversational rhythm. These are precisely the areas where neurodivergent social differences are most apparent. Your flat affect might be interpreted as disinterest or depression. Your unusual prosody and speech patterns might come across as affected or strange. Your different approach to eye contact might seem evasive or intense depending on which way you're compensating. Your stimming behaviors might be read as nervousness or lack of confidence. Before you've even had a chance to demonstrate your intelligence, kindness, creativity, loyalty, or any of the qualities that make you a good partner, you've already been categorized as awkward or weird based on superficial impressions of your neurodivergent traits. This is profoundly unfair, but it's the reality of how human social judgment works, and it means you're fighting an uphill battle from the first moment of interaction. The relationship between neurodivergent traits and perceived masculinity creates additional barriers specific to men. Society expects men to be confident leaders who take social initiative, read situations accurately and act decisively, demonstrate emotional stability and stress tolerance, and project strength and capability. But many neurodivergent traits are interpreted as opposite to these masculine ideals. Your social hesitancy gets read as weak or unconfident. Your need for explicit communication gets read as needing your hand held. Your sensory sensitivities and emotional regulation challenges get read as being overly sensitive or not masculine enough. Your executive function struggles get read as incompetent or unreliable. Women are socialized to seek partners who display traditional masculine traits, and while many women consciously reject these expectations, the unconscious preferences often remain. A neurotypical man who's actually less capable and less emotionally intelligent than you will often be perceived as a better potential partner simply because his social presentation aligns better with masculine stereotypes. You're being judged not on your actual qualities, but on how well you perform a particular type of masculinity that your neurology makes difficult to embody. The isolation of long-term singleness compounds all these issues into a feedback loop that becomes harder to escape over time. Every failed date and every ghosting after a few conversations reinforces your belief that something is fundamentally wrong with you. The gaps in your dating history become something you have to explain, which creates more anxiety and self-consciousness in new interactions. You lose practice with the already difficult skill of dating, making future attempts even harder. Your peer group moves through relationships, marriages, and starting families while you remain stuck in the same place, which increases feelings of inadequacy and difference. The loneliness is profound not just because you lack romantic partnership, but because you lack the basic human experience of feeling chosen and desired by someone else. You start to internalize the rejection as confirmation that you're unlovable, rather than understanding it as a mismatch between your neurological style and the conventional dating process. The depression and hopelessness that develop from years of failure make you even less attractive as a potential partner, creating a spiral that's incredibly difficult to reverse without external intervention or fundamental change in circumstances. Here's the part that's going to make you uncomfortable, but needs to be said anyway. The dating struggles you're experiencing are real, and they're not your fault. But waiting for the world to accommodate your differences isn't a viable strategy if you want a relationship. The neurotypical social framework isn't going away, and most women aren't going to overlook significant social awkwardness and communication differences just to give you a chance to show your other qualities. This doesn't mean you need to become a different person, or that there's something wrong with being neurodivergent. It means you need to develop explicit strategies for navigating a social system that wasn't designed for your brain. Find contexts where your particular combination of traits is less disadvantageous, and potentially seek partners who are also neurodivergent or who have reasons to be more understanding of neurological differences. The mainstream dating advice about being confident and being yourself is useless for you because it assumes a neurotypical baseline that doesn't apply. You need specialized strategies that account for your specific processing differences and social challenges. The working memory issues that plague your dating life have a deeper impact than just forgotten text messages. Your difficulty holding multiple pieces of information in mind simultaneously means you struggle to track conversation threads, remember details she's shared about her life, and connect current topics back to previous discussions. When she mentions something about her job on the second date, you should ideally remember and reference it on the third date to show you were listening and care about her life. But that information didn't stick in your working memory, so you ask the same question again or fail to follow up on something she indicated was important to her. This comes across as not caring or not paying attention, when really your brain just processes and stores information differently. You might have perfect recall for random facts or details about your special interests, but struggle to remember the name of her sister or what she said about her childhood. The selectivity of your memory doesn't make sense to neurotypical people who assume memory works consistently across contexts. She interprets your memory failures as evidence that she's not important to you, when really it's evidence of how your brain allocates cognitive resources differently than hers. The pattern recognition abilities that make you good at your job or hobbies work against you in dating by making you hyper-aware of failure patterns without giving you the tools to change them. You can see clearly that you always struggle at the same points in the dating process. You can identify exactly where conversations tend to go wrong. You notice the subtle moment when her interest shifts from engaged to polite. You recognize the patterns in how relationships fail before they start. But knowing the pattern doesn't give you the ability to interrupt it, because the skills required to navigate these social situations successfully aren't accessible through conscious analysis and pattern recognition alone. They require intuitive, real-time social processing that your brain doesn't do naturally. So you're stuck in this frustrating position of being able to clearly see your failures and predict future failures without having the neurological tools to prevent them. This awareness without capability is actually worse than being oblivious, because you experience the frustration of knowing what's happening while being unable to stop it. The hyper-focus that feels like a superpower in other areas of your life becomes a liability in dating. When you're interested in someone, your brain can fixate on them in ways that come across as intense or even obsessive. You check your phone constantly for messages. You overanalyze every interaction looking for signs of interest or rejection. You research everything about their interests, so you'll have things to talk about. You ruminate on conversations, replaying what you said and what you should have said differently. This level of focus and mental energy directed at another person would be flattering if they could see your internal experience, but from the outside it manifests as either coming on too strong or as anxiety and neediness. Your difficulty regulating this hyper-focus means you can't casually date or keep things light in the early stages. You're either all in or not interested at all, which doesn't match the gradual escalation of investment that dating typically requires. Women sense this intensity, and it triggers their safety concerns or makes them feel pressured, even though you're not doing anything overtly inappropriate. Your internal experience feels like genuine connection and enthusiasm, but your external presentation reads as desperate or unstable. Drop a comment below if you've ever been told you're too intense or that you care too much too fast, because I want you to know you're not alone in this experience, and there are specific reasons why neurodivergent men struggle with intensity regulation in relationships. The emotional regulation differences that characterize neurodivergent brains create misunderstandings that kill relationships before they start. Your emotional responses might be delayed, where you don't feel the impact of an interaction until hours later when you're alone processing the day. Or they might be disproportionately intense, where minor disappointments feel devastating or small excitements feel overwhelming. This disconnect between the timing and intensity of your emotional responses and what's situationally appropriate makes you seem emotionally unstable or immature. When she says something mildly critical and you don't react in the moment, she thinks you don't care. But then you bring it up 2 days later after you've had time to process how it made you feel, and she's confused about why you're dwelling on something she thought was resolved. Or alternatively, you react too strongly in the moment to something minor, and she sees you as oversensitive or unable to handle normal relationship friction. Your difficulty reading the emotional temperature of situations means you're constantly miscalibrated in your responses, either under-responding or over-responding relative to social expectations. The context-switching difficulties that make transitions hard in other areas of life make dating logistics particularly challenging. Moving from work mode to date mode requires a mental shift that doesn't happen quickly or easily for you. You need transition time to change cognitive gears, but dating often involves going straight from your workday to meeting someone for dinner with no buffer period to reset yourself. You show up to dates still partially in work mode, struggling to shift into the social and emotional presence that dating requires. Or you're so exhausted from the workday that you don't have the cognitive resources left for the demanding social interaction of a date. The weekend dates are slightly better because you have more time to prepare yourself mentally. But the executive function load of planning dates, getting ready, getting there on time, and managing the interaction itself is taxing enough that you need significant recovery time afterward. This means you can't sustain the frequency of dates that building a relationship typically requires. You need 3 or 4 days between dates to recover your resources, but she's interpreting that spacing as lack of interest and moving on to guys who want to see her more frequently. The verbal processing differences that make you good at written communication, sometimes but terrible at spontaneous conversation, create a weird discrepancy in dating. Your texting might be thoughtful and engaging because you have time to craft responses and edit them before sending. She develops an impression of you through text as articulate and interesting, which creates expectations for the in-person date. But then face-to-face conversation requires real-time verbal processing, without the editing buffer, and you struggle to find words. Your vocabulary feels limited compared to your written expression, and you can't organize your thoughts clearly, while simultaneously managing all the other demands of the interaction. This discrepancy between your written and verbal presentation feels like catfishing to her, even though you weren't intentionally misrepresenting yourself. She liked the version of you that had time to think and compose responses, but that's not the version she gets in person. For some neurodivergent men, it's the opposite problem, where you're actually better in person than over text, because you can use context and tone to communicate in ways that don't translate to written words. Either way, the inconsistency between communication mediums creates confusion and disappointment. The sensory sensitivities that you've learned to manage in daily life become much harder to hide in dating contexts. The cologne or perfume that most people find pleasant might be overwhelming and distracting to you, but you can't tell someone on a first date that their scent is bothering you without seeming incredibly rude. The restaurant environment that's supposed to be romantic is actually a sensory nightmare with too many sounds, too many people, too many smells, and too much stimulation for you to focus properly on conversation. You're trying to filter out all the background noise to hear what she's saying, and the cognitive effort of that filtering leaves less processing power for actually engaging with the content of the conversation. The physical affection that's expected as relationships progress might involve textures and sensations that are uncomfortable or overwhelming for you. Holding hands when your palms are sweaty creates a sensory experience you can't stop focusing on. Kissing involves tastes and sensations that your brain processes more intensely than neurotypical people experience. These sensory differences aren't something you can just push through or ignore, but explaining them to someone you're dating sounds bizarre if they don't understand neurodivergent sensory processing. So you either avoid physical intimacy and seem uninterested, or you force yourself through uncomfortable sensory experiences and seem tense and awkward. The social energy economics of dating represent a fundamental mismatch between neurodivergent capacity and neurotypical expectations. Neurotypical people generally find social interaction energizing or, at worst, neutral in energy cost. Time spent with a romantic partner is relaxing and recharging for them, which is why they want to spend lots of time together and why frequent contact feels natural. But for you, social interaction costs energy even when it's with someone you really like and enjoy spending time with. The more you like someone, and the more you want to make a good impression, the more energy you spend managing yourself during the interaction. This means the early stages of dating, which should be exciting and energizing, are actually exhausting and depleting for you. The expectation to maintain frequent contact, have long phone conversations, go on multiple dates per week, and constantly engage through text throughout the day exceeds your social energy budget. You can force yourself to meet these expectations short-term, but it's not sustainable long-term, and you'll eventually need to pull back to recover. This pullback gets interpreted as loss of interest or fear of commitment, when really it's just your neurological need for solitude and low stimulation time to recharge your resources. The dating pool available to you is much smaller than the dating pool available to neurotypical men, but nobody talks about this reality. Most women filter out neurodivergent men early in the process, often unconsciously, based on the social presentation differences that signal neurological differences. You're not competing for women's attention on an even playing field with other men. You're competing with a significant handicap that eliminates you from consideration before your other qualities can be evaluated. The women who remain as potential partners after that filtering are a smaller subset, who either don't notice or don't care about neurodivergent social differences, are actively attracted to neurodivergent traits, or are themselves neurodivergent and looking for someone who understands that experience. This smaller pool means you have fewer chances to find compatible matches, and it means you can't afford to be as selective as neurotypical men can be about other compatibility factors. The math of dating is already difficult with the gender ratios and competition dynamics that exist in most locations and age ranges. Adding the filter of neurological compatibility makes the odds substantially worse, which explains why so many neurodivergent men remain single for extended periods, not because they're deficient, but because they're searching for needles in haystacks. The intersection of late diagnosis and dating creates particularly painful complications for men who didn't understand they were neurodivergent until adulthood. You spent your teens and 20s thinking you were just bad at dating, that you were uniquely awkward or socially incompetent, that everyone else had figured out some secret you didn't have access to. You internalized those failures as personal deficiencies rather than understanding them as neurological differences. By the time you get diagnosed or realize you're neurodivergent, you've already accumulated years of negative self-concept and dating trauma. You've already developed maladaptive coping strategies and avoidance patterns. You've already been rejected enough times to develop significant rejection sensitivity. The diagnosis or realization provides context and explanation, but it doesn't undo the damage of years spent believing you were fundamentally unlovable. And it doesn't immediately give you the skills or strategies you need to navigate dating more successfully. You still have to do the work of unlearning harmful beliefs, developing new approaches, and building confidence despite a long history of failure. Some men report that understanding their neurodivergence actually makes dating harder temporarily, because now they're hyper-aware of their differences and more self-conscious about masking or not masking. The relationship escalation timeline that works for neurotypical couples doesn't accommodate neurodivergent processing needs. Neurotypical dating typically moves from first meeting to exclusive relationship within a few months if things are going well. This timeline assumes you can assess compatibility, develop emotional connection, and build trust at a pace that matches frequent interaction and steady escalation of intimacy. But your brain needs more time to process each stage, more explicit communication about expectations and relationship status, and more gradual increases in interaction frequency and emotional intensity. The pressure to define the relationship quickly or escalate physical intimacy on a standard timeline creates anxiety that interferes with your ability to develop genuine connection. You're still figuring out whether you actually like her while she's already expecting emotional commitment. You're still getting comfortable with basic physical affection while she's expecting sexual escalation. The mismatch in pacing makes you seem either not interested enough or interested in the wrong way, when really you just need a different developmental trajectory for relationships. The truth that's hardest to accept is that some of the advice you've received about dating is actually correct for neurotypical men, but counterproductive for you. Being spontaneous and going with the flow sounds good, but your brain functions better with structure and preparation. Being mysterious and playing it cool sounds attractive, but your communication works better when it's direct and explicit. Being confident and assertive sounds appealing, but forcing yourself into that presentation when it's not authentic makes you come across as fake or trying too hard. The dating strategies that work for neurotypical men assume a baseline of social intuition and emotional regulation that you don't have, which means following that advice puts you even further outside your zone of competence. You need strategies specifically designed for neurodivergent social processing, which, unfortunately, are rarely discussed in mainstream dating advice because the market for that information is much smaller. You're stuck trying to implement strategies designed for different neurological hardware, and then blaming yourself when they don't work instead of recognizing that you need a completely different approach. The parallel dating culture that dominates modern dating creates unique problems for neurodivergent processing. You're expected to be casually seeing multiple people simultaneously, keeping track of different conversations and connection levels with each person, maintaining appropriate boundaries so you're not too invested in any one person too early, and making comparative assessments of compatibility across options. This requires executive function and working memory capacity that you're already stretching thin, just managing one connection. Trying to keep track of multiple dating conversations and remember which person you told which stories to, and maintain separate threads of getting to know different people, is cognitively overwhelming. You either focus on one person at a time, which means you're more invested than appropriate and more devastated when it doesn't work out. Or you try to parallel date and end up mixing up details between people, or dropping conversations because you can't maintain that many active social connections. Meanwhile, neurotypical people are effortlessly juggling multiple dating prospects and making strategic decisions about which ones to invest more heavily in based on subtle compatibility signals you're not even perceiving. The performance aspect of early dating conflicts fundamentally with neurodivergent authenticity needs. You're supposed to be presenting your best self, which means suppressing your weird quirks and different behaviors, while also being authentic and genuine so she gets to know the real you. This contradictory requirement is confusing for everyone, but it's especially impossible for neurodivergent men who already struggle with knowing which behaviors are weird quirks to hide versus which are authentic self-expression to share. Your special interests feel like core parts of your identity, but sharing them extensively makes you seem one-dimensional. Your need for direct communication feels authentic, but it violates social rules about being appropriate and building mystery. Your stimming helps you regulate, but doing it openly makes you seem strange. You can't figure out where the line is between acceptable authenticity and off-putting weirdness, so you're constantly overcorrecting in one direction or the other. The neurotypical men competing for the same women don't have this problem because their authentic selves already mostly align with socially acceptable dating behavior. Your authentic self is genuinely different in ways that require careful navigation, but nobody teaches you how to do that navigation effectively. What makes the invisibility in dating particularly painful is that it's not about being seen and rejected for who you are. That would at least provide closure and clarity. Instead, you're being filtered out before anyone actually sees you. You're being rejected based on surface-level social presentation before your depth, intelligence, loyalty, creativity, and capacity for devotion even become visible. The women who would actually be compatible with you and appreciate your neurodivergent traits never get past the first impression to discover those qualities. You're trapped behind a wall of social expectations and communication differences that prevent genuine connection from forming. The neurotypical social performance required to get through the filtering process exhausts you so much that you can't maintain it long enough for someone to see your actual personality. And if you skip the performance and show up authentically from the start, you get filtered out immediately for being too different or weird. There's no winning strategy that lets you be both authentic and successful in conventional dating contexts, which is why so many neurodivergent men end up either alone or in relationships with people who don't really understand them. The years of singleness accumulate into a growing gap between where you are and where society expects you to be at your age. By your 30s, people expect you to have relationship experience, to have learned the skills of partnership and compromise, to have past relationships that inform your understanding of what you want in a partner. But you don't have that experience, or your experience is limited to a few short failed relationships that taught you more about rejection than about actual partnership. This experience gap makes you less attractive to potential partners who want someone who already knows how to be in a relationship. And it makes future relationships harder because you're learning basic relationship skills at an age when others have mastered them. The shame around this experience gap makes you hide it or lie about your relationship history, which creates more inauthenticity in the dating process. Or you're honest about your limited experience, and women interpret that as a red flag indicating something must be wrong with you. The catch-22 is perfect. You can't get relationship experience without someone giving you a chance, but nobody wants to give you a chance without relationship experience. And the longer you remain single, the worse this problem becomes, until you're in your late 30s or 40s with essentially no relationship history and facing near impossible odds of someone taking a chance on you. If you've made it this far in this video, and you're recognizing yourself in these patterns, you need to understand that being neurodivergent and struggling with dating doesn't mean you're broken or unlovable. It means you're trying to navigate a social system that wasn't designed for your neurological operating system. using strategies that don't account for your specific processing differences, while being judged by standards that assume neurotypical baseline functioning. The invisibility you experience in dating isn't about your worth as a person or your capacity to be an amazing partner to someone who actually sees you. It's about the massive filtering that happens in modern dating based on superficial social presentation, and it's about the fundamental mismatch between neurodivergent social processing and the expectations of conventional dating culture. Some neurodivergent men do eventually find partners who appreciate their different way of being in the world, but it usually happens through unconventional paths that bypass the standard dating process, or it happens with partners who are themselves neurodivergent, or who have other reasons to be understanding of neurological differences. The mainstream dating advice and strategies that work for neurotypical men will continue to fail you because they assume capabilities you don't have and ignore the real challenges you face. What you need are approaches specifically designed for neurodivergent social processing, environments where your traits are less disadvantageous, and most importantly, you need to stop internalizing the rejection as evidence that something is wrong with you, rather than evidence that the system itself is biased against neurological differences. The dating struggles you're experiencing are real. They're not your fault, and they don't define your worth or your future possibilities for connection.